Today I'm speaking to Adriaan Basson, the Editor-in-Chief of News24, the country's largest online news platform. It goes without saying that an active media and an independent media is absolutely essential for a healthy democracy, and I think that's even more so as we begin to approach an election. In roughly a year from now, we'll be going to the polls again, and we rely on the media for a lot of the information and analysis that we need in order to make up our minds about how we vote. So media coverage of political parties and politicians is crucially important, but it sometimes seems that it's those that shout the loudest or who make the most provocative statements that get the coverage, rather than political figures who may be more measured and thoughtful. So Adriaan, let's begin by looking at how you go about ensuring the correct balance between the sensational stuff and the serious stuff.
Thanks, Mike. Nice talking to you. Look, I think this is a challenge that's not unique to South Africa and to News24 specifically. We live in an era of personality politics, where a lot of the big politics and political narratives are driven by strong personalities. You can only look at America and their past two elections to understand how they've been grappling with it. I think locally we are sitting with the same thing, where a lot of what the ANC does or is or will achieve is driven by its current leader, Cyril Ramaphosa. As much as we look towards Jacob Zuma to look at lots of the things that were wrong in the past, and I think what our team often tries to do is to cover those personalities. They are obviously enormously influential, but to also look at the parties, the organizations, the institutions, and the policies that belies them. So this remains a challenge and a fine balancing act. I must say, I think the local media has moved away over the past few years from jumping onto every sensational personality story, whether it's Julius Malema or AfriForum. Those stories that one could say are kind of extremist views, or policies that that doesn't speak to kind of the mainstream center, as you said in the beginning. I think we, as News24, certainly no longer just blindly covers every press conference by political leaders. We have a discussion in our newsroom, in our diary meeting, whether a specific press conference on any given day, whether it's by John Steenhuisen or Julius Malema or Songezo Zibi, will add to the context and the understanding of that day's news diary. And then we sometimes decide, no, we've stopped, for example, covering EFF press conferences live because there were just too much misinformation spread during those press conferences by people like Malema, without the opportunity to fact check for us. So when we cover a EFF briefing now, we would not take it live, but rather do a fact check afterwards and then publish our story. So I think there has been more nuance in the way we cover politics. I think we are all still lacking on policy coverage because it's just so overwhelming with the issues of the day, corruption, the energy crisis. It's so overwhelming in your face that I think we sometimes just don't have the hands and the feet to get to those policy matters that are just as deserving of coverage.
Yeah, I read an article recently in the New York Times where a columnist wrote that the media still wants Trump at some half-conscious level. The mainstream media wants the Trump return. They want the Trump ratings. And it just struck me that that must always be a temptation, because, it's going to, and it's going to sell newspapers in the old terminology. It's going to attract people to your platforms, even though you might actually not be very happy with what you have to put across.
Yeah, look, I think the states are in quite a different space. I'm very grateful that in South Africa our media is often criticized and sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for not so good reasons. But I don't think we are as polarized and as ideologically driven as a lot of the American media. It's not clear to me that specific TV stations or news websites in South Africa are ANC leaning or DA leaning or EFF leaning. I think we all try, at least try to to be fair and to be balanced, and give coverage to all the major parties as well as the new players, which is something we can maybe talk later. But that's a hard one, because you don't know what their support base is, and whether they will get support. So someone like Songezo Zibi is getting quite a lot of publicity at the moment without any proven success or not at the polls. Where a party like the UDM or the ACDP may feel that they should be covered more frequently by the likes of News24, which we aren't doing. So yeah, I've also read that piece about Trump. I don't agree with. I mean, we should never just want to cover something for the sake of ratings or clicks. I mean, that's we've long moved on from that, and I can comfortably say that some of the articles that do the best on News24 are not those traditional clickbaity stuff, but substantial arguments, substantial coverage of coalition politics, the way the election will work with independent candidates, for example, anything to do with the potential permutation of a coalition, opposition coalition next year, does very well for us and our readers. So there's definitely an appetite for more substantial coverage, at least on our platform.
Also referring to other journalists and the people in our own media history. Joel Mervis was a great editor of the Sunday Times back in the 1960s and 70s. And he was once asked what was the key to a successful Sunday paper. And his answer was, it's very simple. You've just got to go over Niagara Falls in a barrel every Sunday. I.e., you've got to have a scoop. You've got to have something which attracts the readers, in his case, the clickers in your case. What happens when you don't have a scoop? I'm thinking of temptations where stories have been invented or where journalists have sometimes swallowed fake news. We had the SARS rogue unit story years ago. We had the Cato Manor police hit squad story. More recently, there was that notorious business of, what was it called, the decouplets, the woman who supposedly had 10 babies and so on. I'm not, focusing on those three things in particular, but is this, in a wider sense, a problem in our political journalism, or do you think we largely avoid that trap?
Look, if you are a South African news publication and you struggle to get a scoop every day, there's something wrong with you or your team. I mean, the scoops fall from the trees. I mean, we have so much. I mean, for me, the hardest decision every day is what not to cover, Mike, where we can't go, what policies or debates or events we're just simply not going to have enough hands that day to cover. So I seldom have that problem of not having a strong lead. I agree with the Mervis principle of having a strong lead story every day. I think I subscribe to that kind of form of journalism, that you have to tell your readers what is the biggest story of the day. They may not agree, but at least you gave them your best shot. For example, this morning it was pretty easy. It was the explosion in Johannesburg last night. Everyone wants to know what happened. Am I at risk? What causes? Could there be more explosions? I mean, there's 1,000 questions that we should try to answer. Some days, yes, there aren't a obvious lead story, but I struggle to think of a day where we literally had to almost start being creative in doing an inside type lead, inside the DA's leadership struggle, or inside the explosion, which is a way to get around that unique news angle. But we every day there's something coming out of Parliament, whether it's a debate in a portfolio committee that only our journalists attended, or a new piece of legislation that hasn't really been spoken about. And then also we have a few provincial offices in the Eastern Cape, KZN, and we've strengthened those offices. And those stories are just sometimes really horrific. The state of education, the state of hospitals in the Eastern Cape, political violence in KZN, almost on a daily or bi-daily basis. There's a story of some kind of political violence or corruption event up in northern KZN. So, I think, sometimes I wish for a boring day, which doesn't happen that frequently. Just to speak to your examples and of course others, I think those were huge blotches on the record of South African journalism. I'm very glad that the Sunday Times had apologized for those two examples you mentioned, and that Anton Harber wrote a fantastic book as kind of a warning for future editors and journalists, how not to get trapped in those false narratives. And it's something we have to check each other on a daily basis. And that I would like to think at News24 we do. You know, we have very frank discussions. We often ask each other whether we're not being used for someone's cause. Just in the past few weeks, we've been leading the coverage on Paul Mashatile, the deputy president, and his extravagant lifestyle. And there's been serious accusations that we are driving a political campaign. Now, I know it's not true because I know exactly how the story started, how we got onto those stories, and it's got absolutely nothing to do with a political campaign. But it's good to just from time to time check in with each other. You know, are we being used by a faction, you know, to divert attention from something else? And then just to have those conversations openly and frankly without being scared to go big and choose your story and champion that story.
That leads to the next question. When you undertake an investigation like that and you're publishing stories like that, you're bound to make enemies in the political world, and a good media house is going to make lots of them across the political spectrum. What kind of cooperation do you get from political parties in this country? Do you find that they are suspicious of the media in general, or do they understand and respect your role? Do you find yourself coming under pressure to report favorably on certain parties? How's that relationship overall?
I think that relationship will always be one that involves tension, because on the one hand, my political editor, Quinita Hunter, and her team has to get the scoops and the inside understandings and dynamics from at least the biggest party. So they have to hang out with these politicians. They have to get briefings from them. They have to have cordial relationships with them. On the other hand, our opinion section and our investigation section often, you know, maligns these politicians and parties in the uncovering corruption or, you know, maladministration, or commenting quite harshly about them. So there's always this tension, but I think it's a healthy tension. I think, you know, no political parties should think that they can tell News24 what to do, or that they have a friendly in here, but they should all know that we will give them fair treatment. So I'm very happy whenever I'm asked by a politician for a right to reply when we publish something really critical of them. I'm very happy to publish that right to reply with the proviso that it, you know, confirms to our standards, and that it doesn't defame or malign personalities. There are some parties that don't always react as well to criticism. You know, if you think of, for example, the DA's federal chairperson, Helen Zille, she really cannot stand criticism by the media, and often then uses her Twitter feed to kind of criticize the media. But again, you know, that's not unique to South Africa. Politicians all over the world think that the fact that they can tweet now, they don't need us in the media anymore. Big mistake, I think. But, you know, we deal with it. And then, unfortunately, sometimes, like in the case of the Patriotic Alliance, they just completely stop speaking to us. So they don't respond to our questions or anything, because according to them, they can't trust us. Because we've been critical about them and what they do and say, and how these things don't often match up. So, you know, we try to keep an open door. I particularly try to have cordial relationships with political leaders across the spectrum, which I do have. But it's never a case of being friendly or biased.
Right. Looking at press freedom, Reporters Without Borders ranks South Africa 25th out of 180 countries that they've measured. When it comes to media freedom, that's one place better than the United Kingdom, and to my amazement, 20 places better than the United States. That seems like very, very good news. But are there threats, perhaps, to media freedom that we should be worried about?
Certainly. Let me start with the good news. I think that we, almost every day, I, you know, just thank and realize the amazing freedom we have under Section 16 of the Constitution to write what we like. You know, in South Africa, a few years ago, I published a book with my colleague Peter de Tooy titled Enemy of the People, with Jacob Zuma's face on it. I mean, if I did that in many countries, not only in Africa, all over the world, I would have been in prison by now. So, you know, we have to celebrate and champion our freedom of expression and never take it for granted. We can't rest on our laurels. We have to continue fighting for our media freedom and freedom of the press that was negotiated in the early 90s and affected through Section 16 of the Constitution. And a part of that, Mike, is that the courts have been extremely protective over the media, over that right. You know, it's very seldom that I feel the courts have given us an unfair hearing. You know, often when the media goes to the court, most recently, for example, Amabungane was taken to court by a subject of their critical reporting, and ultimately the court ruled in the media's favor, in the favor of freedom of expression. So I do feel blessed and really grateful to what we have. But that doesn't mean we don't have issues. My colleague Karen Morn was recently drawn before a criminal court by Jacob Zuma in a so-called private prosecution, which was an absolute abuse of court process, but something which the system allowed, you know. So politicians like Zuma and his legal team are constantly on the lookout for ways to intimidate journalists through these means, and they've become more creative through, for example, private prosecutions. This case is a landmark case. It will definitely be used going forward to defend the rights of journalists to report. But certainly, just by charging Karen and just by dragging her into the accused box in court, you know, that we pay a high price for that. It's not good and healthy for any journalist to be in that position. Particularly if you did absolutely nothing wrong. There's not even a case against you. The fact that was allowed to happen is certainly a red flag. And then, Mike, a lot of my colleagues go out every day into volatile areas where there's service delivery protests or, you know, vigilante incidents. And often we find these days angry communities turn their anger onto the media. We've had a number of cases where cameramen specifically were attacked. Some of my very young colleagues who go into these areas are robbed of their equipment, of their phones, of their watches and wallets. Unfortunately, the victims sometimes of common criminals, but also, you know, I am worried that there's not always the kind of understanding and appreciation for the role of journalists and the media at a story like a service delivery protest. You know, it's not always clear, I think, to those people who feel aggrieved why we are there and what we are doing to help amplify their message in the national press, to give attention to their message. And I think there's work to be done there by not only us, but hopefully by civil society and the government to educate the population about the role of the media, and that we are really an extension of the public. We are the public's ears and eyes and voice when they can't always speak or be heard and seen. So maybe there's also something for us to do in that space.
Yeah, and of course, if the media wasn't there, we would soon really begin to miss it, as you and a number of other publications keep pointing out. So that brings me to the last point, and that's around sustainability. I mean, we are seeing, obviously, the print media everywhere in the world gradually losing ground. Our newspapers get thinner and thinner and more expensive. Circulations are dropping fast. I read yesterday that independent media are planning to retrench up to 40% of their staff. Digital platforms like yours and Daily Maverick and so on look like they're thriving, but we're also starting to see paywalls, more paywalls, pleas for financial support, etc. So what is the future holding for journalism, and in particular in our country for, you know, good, solid, independent political reporting?
So look, I think I'm trying to keep a positive view on this because, you know, some of the numbers I've seen, never in the history of humankind has as many people consumed news as they are today because of digital platforms. So I think that's a good thing. I think the fact that we've gradually moved from paper to digital actually increased democracy and democratized the media. But we live in a reality, Mike, where that model that sustained newspapers, which was always advertising plus subscription. Yeah. That model has broken because the advertising part of that old model, which was the biggest part of any newspaper business, has gone to Google and Facebook. Any South African corporate at the moment, big, large corporate, spends between 80 and 90% of their marketing budget on Facebook and Google. So that, let's call it 10% of marketing budgets that come to all of us in the local media still has to be cut up between Media24, Arena, Caxton, Mail and Guardian, Maverick, etc. Yeah. So I think, it would, of course, I would have loved to just give away our content for free forever, but that's going to take us nowhere, and that's going to actually lead us to a place where we have to shut shop and retrench journalists. So as we have seen globally, most of the respected news titles that I read every day across the world have introduced some sort of subscription model, whether it's a hard paywall, a freemium paywall, a metered paywall, a dynamic paywall. There's 1,000 of options that you can do this, where you ask your readers to pay for the news, and I think the News24 model I'm very comfortable with. I think it's an extremely reasonable amount of money at 75 Rand a month. I'm pretty sure it's less than what my dad paid in the 90s for his daily newspaper subscription. So I think it's a reasonable amount. And but again, I think it's a behavioral change. The internet was free for almost 20 years. Everything on the internet, from music to movies to news, were free. And everyone has moved away from that model, and some earlier than others. And I think we're one of the last sectors to kind of go into that quality but paid for model after music and movies and all of that. So, we just have to keep going at it. I hope that many more South African readers and members of the public will realize that they have to pay, and why they have to pay for journalism online. It's still the same journalists who used to go out in the Toyotas to the crime scenes than we did in the days of newspapers. Nothing had changed. Someone still has to pay those salaries for those cars. The only thing that fell away is the paper and the ink, which obviously was a huge benefit to our cost base. But then you also lost those advertising, which I spoke about. So at this point, I think there's probably the two models that I see thriving. The one is the subscription model, as like we have publications like the New York Times, the largest subscription website in the world, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, and many other mainstream news publications in Europe, Australasia, Asia, and South America. And then you have this membership model, which someone like The Guardian in the UK and Daily Maverick locally has, where people are kind of members and they contribute whatever they could. But of one thing I'm certain is that all of us will need a solid stream of reader revenue to be able to sustain our newsrooms into the future.
And in terms of digital accessibility, to what extent is this a problem that, we have a divide between people who can pay some monthly subscription or whatever it may be and have digital access, easy access to these platforms, and then the rest, rural people who don't have that kind of money, etc. Is there any way in which this kind of new approach to media can reach them, or are they destined to be marginalized?
Look, I wish I had the SABC's budget, because they are really the one media house that is supposed to deliver good quality public interest media for free to all South Africans. Look, Mike, we have over 100% cell phone penetration in South Africa. Every adult in South Africa has a cell phone, even more than one. So the challenge is there for all of us. The challenge is there for News24 to make sure that people, irrespective of their social standing and income, can to us at least to read the news that's still for free. We still have a large chunk of what I would call public interest or breaking news that's free, that we can never charge for, because it's news that's freely available elsewhere. And I fully accept that some people in South Africa will never be able to buy any subscription, but hopefully we can be there for both those audiences, for those who can pay and for those who can't, but who will still receive kind of public interest, big big news events like the explosion in Johannesburg last night, that kind of life and death and risk content for free. But like I said earlier, you know, unfortunately, I don't have the luxury of receiving taxpayers' money to deliver content for free only. I mean, that is squarely the SABC's constitutional function. In a country like England, I mean, you have the BBC fulfilling that role very well, you know, and they produce magnificent journalism from the budgets they get. But I think, yeah, maybe that's another discussion of whether the SABC actually fulfills the constitutionally mandated role, or whether us in commercial media is trying to do that, but without the budgets flowing to us.
Good. I've been talking to Adriaan Basson, Editor-in-Chief of News24. Adriaan, thanks very much for your time, and good luck. It's going to be a very interesting year as we run up to the elections, and we do rely on your platform and others for the really good reporting and the analysis that you give us. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks for having me.